Less than 3 weeks after her recommissioning on March 1st, 1931, and before she could even conduct her post-modernization sea trials, the USS Arizona would receive a very special guest. On March 19th, then just over 2 years into his term, the 31st President of the United States, Herbert Hoover, stepped onto the deck of the newly refurbished battleship. The ship had pulled in at Old Point Comfort, Virginia. There, the President's specially configured boat came to meet them, with Hoover himself on board, as well as his entourage. The latter included the 31st United States Secretary of the Interior, Ray Lyman Wilbur, the 51st United States Secretary of War, Patrick J. Hurley, Naval Aide Russell Train, and Senior Military Aide to the President, Campbell B. Hodges. Hoover's purpose on board wasn't to conduct a naval review, but would be much more recreational in nature. The ship was to take him on a 10-day vacation tour to the Caribbean that would allow him to relax from his work in the Oval Office. He was to visit Puerto Rico and the Virgin Islands, both of which had become American territories in the same year of 1917, under the Wilson administration. Arizona took on supplies from Norfolk before setting off for the President's trip into southern waters, the President's flag fluttering from her main mast. Along the way, Hoover would enjoy dining at sea with Arizona's commanding officer, Captain Charles Seymour Freeman, attended an officer's party, and took pictures with both the officers and crew. Upon his return trip to America, he received a visit from a U.S. Army dirigible, or blimp, which met the Arizona while she was still at sea, lowering a mailbag full of state papers meant for the President's attention. At the end of the 10-day foray into the Caribbean, she would return to Hampton Roads, Virginia on March 29th, where she would disembark the President and his party. She would then sail north, heading for Rockland, Maine, to run her post-modernization sea trials. There she had another catapult fitted atop turret 3 towards the stern of the ship. After a visit to Boston, the battleship dropped down to Norfolk. From there, she would be transferred to the west coast alongside her sister ship, Pennsylvania. The two would sail for San Pedro, California on the 1st of August 1931, assigned to Battleship Division 3, the Battle Force. Just a month later, on September 18th, the Guangdong Army of Imperial Japan would invade their own puppet state of Manchukuo in Manchuria, a region in the northeast of modern China. This was done in the aftermath of the Mukden incident, where a small quantity of dynamite was detonated close to a railway line owned by Japan's South Manchuria Railway near Mukden, now Shenyang. The explosion dealt fairly unsubstantial damage to the railway. The Guangdong Army itself had instigated both the Mukden incident and the invasion of Manchuria against the expressed orders of the political and military echelons in Tokyo. The army had essentially strong-armed its own government into going along with the act to secure raw materials for the empire's burgeoning industries. The United States, for its part, objected to Japan's invasion and subsequent occupation of China, sparking the beginning of tensions between the two countries. The next year, on the Sunday morning of February 7, 1932, Arizona would participate in Grand Joint Exercise No. 4. Conducted as a lead-up to Fleet Problem 13 in March, GJE-4 was divided into two forces, Blue Force representing the US and Black Force representing the Japanese. Blue's mission was to recapture Hawaii from the Black Force, which had captured it earlier. Blue Force included the two carriers USS Lexington and USS Saratoga, as well as an amphibious expeditionary force of 40,000 troops aboard 25 transports. Admiral Yarnell, a naval officer known for his unconventional thinking, was a strong proponent of naval aviation. He believed the long-range strike capabilities of a carrier task force had surpassed those of the fleet's current capital ship, the battleship. He pushed strongly for the construction of more aircraft carriers and a reduction in the number and role of battleships. This view, of course, was frowned upon by many more traditionally minded officers. Yarnell took the opportunity to prove the value of the carrier and its accompanying air wing. He decided to break off a subset of the Blue Fleet as an advanced raiding force, consisting of the two carriers and just 4 destroyer escorts. This would mark the first appearance of this new naval grouping, afterward known as a task force. The force was to conduct a surprise attack on the island of Oahu, focusing on Army airfields and the Navy base at Pearl Harbor. Yarnell believed attacking on a Sunday was critical, as most military personnel would be off-duty and thus unable to report quickly to their battle stations. Admiral Richard Henry Lay, the commander-in-chief of the battle force and the Blue Fleet, adopted the plan. The task force separated from the rest of Blue Fleet on February 5th and proceeded towards Hawaii on its own. After a high-speed 25-knot run to within 100 miles north of Oahu, the carriers launched 152 aircraft in 2 waves just before dawn on Sunday, February 7th. The aircraft were a mix of escort fighters, dive bombers, and torpedo planes. Yarnell's aircraft, which approached from the northeast of the island, went undetected until they descended out of the cloud cover to begin their attacks, achieving total surprise. Striking Army airfields across Oahu, the bombers then went after naval installations at Pearl Harbor. Attacking aircraft fired flares to simulate machine gun fire and dropped flour bag bombs on the ships in the harbor. While opinions on Black Fleet damage varied, it was clear the attack was an outright success. In a later public critique on February 18th, it was deemed that all Army aircraft had been destroyed and all Navy warships at Pearl Harbor had been sunk. Admiral Yarnell believed that in real life, such an air raid would have utterly devastated Army aviation assets across the board. In stark contrast to elements within the US Navy, especially the battleship admirals, who refused to acknowledge the success or innovativeness of the 1932 attacks, naval leaders in Japan paid close attention. Japanese military observers were on board fishing vessels off Oahu, taking detailed notes about everything they witnessed. The Japanese consulate in Honolulu sent a detailed memo to Tokyo, exposing how the surprise attack was accomplished. The Japanese War College studied the original 1932 attack 4 years later. They came to the conclusion that, quote, in case the enemy's main fleet is berthed at Pearl Harbor, the idea should be to open hostilities by surprise attack from the air. Japanese military leadership had learned the value of the 1932 attack. US military leadership had not. The following year, Arizona had returned to the western seaboard from Fleet Problem 14, the first naval exercise to simulate aircraft carrier attacks against the west coast of the United States. There, she would suddenly find herself anchored just off the scene of a disaster. On the evening of March 10th, a 6.4 magnitude earthquake shook the community of Long Beach, California. The epicenter was offshore, southeast of the city on the Newport-Inglewood Fault. Damage to buildings was widespread throughout Southern California, resulting in 120 deaths and an estimated $40 million worth of property damage, equivalent to $941 million in 2023. Long Beach was the worst affected due to a combination of unfavorable geological conditions and poorly built infrastructure. Buildings collapsed, water tanks fell through roofs, and houses were tossed from their foundations, with a massive number of structural failures occurring at schools. Most of the fatalities resulted from people running out of buildings, exposing themselves to the falling debris. Arizona was anchored in San Pedro at the time of the devastation. She was only several miles away from Long Beach, and was thus put in the best position to assist. Sailors from the ship arrived in the aftermath of the destruction and joined in the relief efforts. There they helped to provide food, medical attention, and provide security from looters seeking to capitalize on the chaos. Early 1934 would see the battleship in the Hollywood spotlight for her first taste of fame. She would star in the film Here Comes the Navy, a James Cagney and Warner Brothers romantic comedy. The film follows the adventures of riveter Chesty O'Connor as he navigates the life in the Navy alongside a burgeoning relationship with the sister of his worst enemy. During the film, both Arizona and her crew were shown in action. Emphasis was placed on the use of her 14-inch guns, as well as other onboard and exterior aesthetics of the ship. As summer rolled in and her short Hollywood career rolled out, Arizona would soon find herself making the morning papers for all the wrong reasons. On the early morning of July 26th, at approximately 2 a.m., on a clear and moonlit night, the 52-foot fishing trawler Umatilla was making her way across the waters just 2 miles off Cape Flattery, Washington. She was being towed by another fellow trawler, while a third, the Emblem, trailed behind her. Arizona just so happened to be piloting through those very same waters. At 14 knots, the 600-foot, 29,000-ton battleship overtook the Emblem from astern. When a collision with the Emblem appeared imminent, Arizona's then commanding officer, Captain McGillivray Milne, ordered the ship's whistle to be blown. The crew of the Emblem responded by turning to port. Arizona missed the Emblem by about 50 yards, but rammed the Umatilla headlong in her stern, cutting her in two. Crewmen Lawrence Halsan and John Urusak were killed. In the wake of the incident, 7 surviving crewmen were fished out of the water by the crew of the Emblem. Arizona did not stop to render assistance, however, and proceeded to her destination at San Diego. Naval Headquarters radioed Arizona and asked Milne if he would investigate. To this, Milne is recorded to have replied, and I quote, "On account of great delay involved in securing testimony of non-English speaking witnesses and the importance of carrying out present schedule, Board of Investigation was not convened on board Arizona." The Emblem and a Coast Guard tender towed the 2 pieces of the Umatilla to shore, where she was beached. The Navy immediately held a court of inquiry aboard Arizona and her sister ship, Pennsylvania. The survivors sued the Navy for wrongful death and for the loss of the fishing boat. The court held that although the Umatilla's lights might not have conformed to regulation, the captain of the Arizona was at fault in the accident. The subsequent court-martial convicted Milne of culpable inefficiency in the performance of duty. In the end, he was sentenced to a reduction of 3 numbers in his grade. He would retain his captain's rank, but being reduced by 3 numbers meant that 3 officers below him would be promoted before he could be considered for promotion. During testimony, the Umatilla's crew, immigrants of Croatian, Norwegian, and Yugoslavian backgrounds, demonstrated fluency in English, something Milne said was not the case. The families of the 2 victims would go on to receive compensation from the government. Several months later, after the ship returned to the West Coast, Milne was officially relieved of his command of Arizona by Captain George Martin Baum. Never again was Milne to captain a ship. All the while, Rear Admiral Samuel W. Bryant had assumed command of Battleship Division 2 on September 4th, with Arizona serving as his flagship. The Umatilla, meanwhile, would be repaired and renamed the Superior. She would go on to be active in Alaskan waters as late as the 1990s. Come May 1935, the battleship would participate in Fleet Problem 16. The operational exercise was held in the northern Pacific off the coast of Alaska and in waters surrounding the Hawaiian Islands. It was divided into 5 distinct phases, modeled on proposals for a U.S. offensive in the Pacific. This would prove to be the largest of these interwar exercises and was consequently seen as a provocation by Japan, which conducted its own major exercise in response. On January 15, 1936, members of multiple nations arrived at the Second London Naval Conference. They were there to sign an international treaty of the same name, one meant to limit their country's growth in naval armaments until its expiration in 1942. Notably absent from the conference were the delegates from Japan, a signatory of the First London Naval Treaty, and an empire already at war on the Asian mainland. The lack of Japan's presence at the conference prevented a consensus on the ceiling on the number of warships each signatory nation could possess. In May of that same year, Arizona was involved in Fleet Problem 17, which took her down the west coast of the US, Central America, and the Panama Canal Zone, the latter allowing her to make yet another port visit to the city of Balboa. On the 24th of July, which by my own reckoning seems to be a very troublesome month for Arizona, her turret crew would experience an accident that had the potential to prove catastrophic. During gunnery practice, combustion gases from one of the guns of Turret 2 entered the gun turret, burning 1 crewman. The turret sprinkling system was switched on, however, and prevented a powder explosion. Nevertheless, the released water leaked into the turret's electrical switchboard, starting another small fire that was also quickly and thankfully put out. Due to budgetary constraints for the Navy, Arizona spent most of this period in port as a fuel-saving measure. In fiscal year 1936-37, she was anchored for 267 days. The following year, she was in port for 255 days. The ship spent the rest of her career based on the West Coast or in Hawaii. On January 2, 1937, Rear Admiral John Queenslade assumed command of Battleship Division 2. He transferred his flag to the battleship Maryland in April, taking away Arizona's flagship status, only for her to regain it a few months later when Rear Admiral Manly H. Simons, commander of Battleship Division 1, transferred his flag to her. In 1938, with the shadow of another world war looming over Europe, Arizona participated in Fleet Problem 19 off Hawaii between April to May. This operation focused on seizing advanced fleet bases and defending them against minor opposition. It gave the Navy more experience in the use of submarines, destroyers, and aircraft for scouting and attack, while also testing the capabilities of the Hawaiian Defense Force. On September 7th, Captain Alfred Windsor Brown would die suddenly of a heart attack in his sleep. Arizona's new captain, Captain Isaac Kidd, would assume command of the ship 10 days later. That same day of September 17th would also see Battleship Division 1 falling under the command of a certain Rear Admiral Chester Nimitz. Nimitz would be relieved almost a year later, on May 27th, 1939, and would go on to serve as the Chief of the Bureau of Navigation. Meanwhile, Arizona would fall under the divisional command of his replacement, Rear Admiral Russell Wilson, on September 17th. On September 1st of that very same year, Nazi Germany would invade Poland, officially beginning the Second World War. Soviet Russia, Germany's then geopolitically neutral bedfellow, would send its own forces to take eastern Poland on the 17th. The Allies, such as Great Britain and France, quickly began preparing for what many thought would be a rehash of the mudslogging, grinding, trench-to-trench warfare of what they now understood as the First World War. Many eyes would turn to the United States for her direct intervention, only to be greeted with the all-too-familiar scene of an isolationist USA. The prevailing sentiment among many in America was that the war was a dispute between foreign nations, and that the United States had neither the need nor desire to get involved again in European affairs. This sentiment was not unwarranted either. The US had primarily entered the First World War in response to the resumption of unrestricted submarine warfare, which Imperial Germany had unleashed upon her merchant and passenger ships in 1917. Given that the country had lost 100,000 of its own to help the Allied powers win the last war, many weren't eager to find out what the butcher's bill would be in this newest conflict, one whose technological innovations in warfare seemed to promise an even bloodier toll. However, foreign affairs about to unfold on the other side of the world would soon force many Americans to abandon the hope of neutrality altogether. On July 5, 1940, the United States Congress would pass the Export Control Act, imposing restrictions on the exports of critical resources to Japan, including oil and steel. These were resources absolutely vital to the empire's goals of impending territorial expansion in the Pacific. The passing of the act caused American-Japanese relations to deteriorate into an even worse condition than they already were. Both sides had already been sizing up each other for years, as was seen to be the case in the Japanese-focused defensives of many of the US Navy's fleet problems. Now, their relations were one step closer to complete collapse. Japan, for its part, would take yet another step when, on September 27, 1940, her ambassador to Germany, Saburo Kurusu, Mussolini's son-in-law, Count Galeazzo Ciano, and Nazi Germany's Minister of Foreign Affairs, Joachim von Ribbentrop, in the presence of Hitler himself, signed the Tripartite Pact in Berlin. The pact, primarily directed at the US, brought into existence the Alliance of the Axis Powers. Earlier in the year, between April 1st to May 17th, the USS Arizona was involved in Fleet Problem 21. It was the first since Problem 9 in 1928 that did not involve almost all of the active fleet. By then, two-time President Franklin D. Roosevelt had suggested that the exercise focus on the Southwest Pacific. However, due to logistical concerns, it was held within the vicinity of Hawaii, on the premise of an enemy invasion force advancing toward the islands after having captured the Philippines. On May 7th, only days after the conclusion of Fleet Problem 21, the fleet received orders to remain in Hawaii. Their presence there was meant to serve as a deterrent against Japan's growing aggressiveness. Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet, Admiral James Richardson, disagreed with the orders. He believed that at Hawaii, the fleet would be vulnerable to air attacks. Such had been shown to be the case during the simulated fleet problems. However, after months of objection, Richardson was fired and bumped down to a Rear Admiral, a rank he would retain until his retirement. He was replaced by Admiral Husband Kimmel, who was now the Commander-in-Chief of the Pacific Fleet. The fleet remained stationed in Hawaii throughout the rising crisis with Japan. Among their number was the Arizona. Fleet Problem 21 would be the last fleet problem for the US Navy, but for Arizona in particular. From October 1940 to January 1941, the battleship would remain at the Puget Sound Navy Yard in Bremerton, Washington, for an overhaul. There, she received a refit that saw the foundation of a search radar added to the top of her foremast, the upgrading of her anti-aircraft directors, and the installation of a platform for 4 water-cooled M2 Browning machine guns atop her mainmast. Her next change of Rear Admirals would come on January 23rd, when Rear Admiral Russell Wilson was relieved of his command of Battleship Division 1 by Rear Admiral Isaac Kidd. Her next change of captains would come shortly thereafter on February 5th, when Captain Harold Cecil Train was relieved by Captain Franklin van Valkenburg. On the morning of October 22, 1941, Arizona would be in the middle of an exercise taking place in heavy fog when she would collide with her older predecessor, USS Oklahoma, hitting her in the bow while receiving a port-side blister in return. The resulting damage was not sufficient to seriously compromise either ship. Nevertheless, that is not where the tragedy lies here. Arizona was scheduled to depart for an overhaul at the Bremerton Navy Yard in November. However, the accident and its consequent damage required her to be dry docked at Pearl Harbor for repairs, ensuring that she would remain within Hawaiian waters towards the end of the year. Again, this is another case of my own personal interjection into this story, but it almost seems to be the hands of fate at work that caused Arizona to remain where she was, which, given what was about to happen, was in hindsight the very last place she needed to be. On December 4th, while in Hawaii, she would perform a sortie in the form of a night firing exercise as part of Battleship Division 1, alongside USS Oklahoma and USS Nevada. The next day, all 3 ships would moor themselves at the quays alongside Ford Island. The day after that, December 6th, would see the repair ship Vestal come alongside Arizona to help the crew with effectuating minor repairs. The day after that would hardly have come at all, before it seemed already over. While the US was engaged in its fleet problems, Japan had not been idle. Not by any means. Despite the restrictions that had been placed on it by the United States, it had hardly given up on its designs for domination of the Pacific. All the while, it had kept America's Navy well in its sights. Japan had long been considering its options against the only other serious geopolitical power in the Pacific. It had entered into negotiations with the US on February 12, 1941. However, ultimately, on July 26th, Roosevelt would freeze all Japanese assets in the United States. On November 26th, the Hull Note would be delivered to the Japanese government by America. Named after the Secretary of State, Cordell Hull, it was the culmination of a series of events leading up to the morning of December 7th. It repeated previously made demands by the US for Japan to withdraw its armed presence from China and French Indochina. No further proposals would be made. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto would be the man that would turn Japan's desire to lash out against the US into a concrete strategy. Born the son of a samurai, he was a veteran of the Russo-Japanese War and an experienced officer in the Japanese Navy. He was a part of the Japanese naval establishment and promoted a policy of a strong fleet to project naval strength for international diplomacy, rather than as a glorified chauffeur for the army. This put him in opposition to the invasion of China. He likewise opposed the prospect of war with the United States, possibly due to his having studied at Harvard University and having served 2 postings as a naval attaché in Washington, D.C., a post that helped him to speak fluent English. He had also traveled extensively throughout the U.S. during his tour of duty, and had studied American customs and business practices. Promoted to captain in 1923, he was a part of the Japanese delegation visiting the United States Naval War College the following year. He participated in the First London Naval Conference in 1930 as a Rear Admiral and attended the Second London Naval Conference in 1935 as a Vice Admiral. By November 15, 1940, Yamamoto was promoted to the rank of Admiral. By this point, he had long recognized that war with the United States was inevitable. He began planning accordingly for a quick victory meant to knock out the U.S. Pacific Fleet at Pearl Harbor. As Japan moved toward a war footing in 1940, Yamamoto gradually moved towards strategic as well as tactical innovations. This included approving the reorganization of Japanese carrier forces into the 1st Air Fleet, or Kido Butai, a strike force comprised of Japan's 6th largest carriers. This innovation gave the unit great striking capacity, but also concentrated the vulnerable carriers into a single target. In January 1941, Yamamoto proposed a consequential revision of Japanese naval strategy, which went against the decades-old doctrine of Captain Alfred Thayer Mahan. Aware of American strategic advantages in military production capacity, Yamamoto proposed seeking parity with the Americans by first reducing their forces with a preventative strike. The strike would be followed up with a Mahan-style decisive battle fought offensively rather than defensively. Yamamoto began developing a plan to attack the American base at Pearl Harbor, which the Japanese continued to refine over the coming months. Come November 7th, the Admiral had set the date for the intended surprise attack. It would commence on December 7th for one simple reason. It was a Sunday, the day that, as Admiral Yarnell had noticed almost a decade earlier, American military personnel would be least alert to an attack. The First Air Fleet commenced preparations for the Pearl Harbor raid, solving multiple technical problems along the way, including how to launch torpedoes in the shallow waters of the harbor, and how to craft armor-piercing bombs by machining down projectiles meant for battleship guns.